We're going to move on to the second part of our events now, and I think that everyone is really eager to hear, first of all, more about the findings of the MEDAM research, independent research, and the report that's being published today. So to give us the first introduction to this original research, which is actually quite cumbersome, difficult to conduct in pandemic times. So I want to commend Olivia as well as her colleague Martin Roos, who's a professor and deputy director at the Migration Policy Center. I want to commend them for their efforts to put this fascinating piece of research together that's super valuable. I want to invite Martin Roos to give us the key takeaway points from this research before we open our discussion to a panel debate with Angeliki Dimitriadi, who's a senior research fellow and head of migration program at ELIAMEP of Greece, as well as Asli Aydin Tashbash, who's a senior policy fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations. Martin, I'll pass the floor to you first. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Yes, as Martina mentioned, the Mercator Dialogue on Asylum and Migration produces an annual report on migration policies in Europe. And this year, our report, which we published today, focuses on EU-Turkey cooperation on migration. And there's different aspects to it. But one of the areas that we emphasize and focus on that I'll talk about now is that if you want to talk about cooperation that is sustainable and it's cooperation among equal partners, you really need to understand the interests and policy preferences in each of the countries centrally involved. And that includes, in our view, not only how policymakers think about these issues about cooperation, but also how the public and how voters think about cooperation on irregular migration and refugee protection. So part of the work that we did this year is exactly that, to find out how do people think about the EU-Turkey Statement, the migration cooperation that was agreed in 2016, and what types of policies generate opposition and support for this overall cooperation. So what we did was we conducted surveys with about 3,900 voters, people across 3 countries. Turkey, Greece as the first country of arrival of many migrants, and then Germany as a major destination country. And the samples were nationally representative in terms of the gender, age, and region of the voting age population. And what we did was, rather than asking people about the policies that are included in the deal one by one, we recognize that these are really packages. So the cooperation includes various different policies: EU financial assistance for Greece, resettlement, stepped up border controls by Turkey. So what we did was we gave our respondents different types of cooperation packages and asked them which one they prefer. What type of cooperation along these 4 or 5 different dimensions that are in the current deal do you prefer? And that kind of method allows you to identify which types of policies generate support for the overall cooperation and what types of policy generate opposition, and how does that vary across these 3 countries. And I'll just give you some of the key findings. So again, this is based on surveys we conducted earlier this year in Germany, Greece, and Turkey. So the overall big picture finding is that among the dimensions of the deal that we analyzed, broadly, there was considerable public support for cooperation on irregular migration and refugee protection along the broad lines of the EU-Turkey Statement, with some exceptions. A second finding is that in Germany and Greece, there's quite considerable opposition to pushbacks. This is something that, Martina, you discussed with Vice President in the first half of the session. So we asked people if migrants arrive and if migrants are sent back without first assessing their asylums and applications for asylum, this is something that voters reject quite strongly in Germany and in and in Greece. So I think that's some evidence that there's clear demand to still have a functioning asylum system in the EU. Another finding was that there was support, as I mentioned before, for EU financial assistance for refugees in Turkey. German and Greek voters support that, but they only support this if this assistance is channeled via humanitarian or international organizations and not via direct budget support for the Turkish government. So the channel of support matters for public support, the channel of assistance. And this is quite significant because, as we also discuss in the report, we know that the Turkish government has been asking for some time for more support to be given as direct budget support. But this is actually something that would be quite unpopular among German and Greek voters. And the final point I want to highlight, a final finding, is on resettlement. So this is an area where we found support for doing things differently. So one idea that we presented people with is that every year the European Union would resettle 1% of the Syrian refugee population in Turkey. That's about 36,000 people every year. And that policy, so that hypothetical policy, is much preferred to the current policy, which is based on a one-to-one mechanism. So currently under the deal, for every one Syrian refugee returned from Greece to Turkey, one Syrian refugee is resettled from Turkey to the European Union. In practice, this has not worked very well. In some ways, I think it's potentially also quite a confusing policy. This other mechanism that we proposed, 1% of the Syrian refugee population in Turkey every year, is much favored. So again, I think this is evidence that there is support for resettlement. So not only for giving money through financial assistance, but also for resettling people to the EU. There's a lot more in it, but I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Martin. And that leaves us a good amount of time to have an active conversation with yourself and Angeliki and Aslı. I'd like to first invite Angeliki first and Aslı next to offer some reflections on the question of the EU-Turkey statement, especially in the context of discussion of its renewal and the new migration pact. And if I may, just one point I would really love to hear more about is the question I also put to the Vice President, that sort of we've judged the statement in the context of when it was put together in 2016 and what was happening then. Is it still fit for purpose as the baseline for new negotiations? Angeliki, if you want to start first, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Martin, for this very interesting presentation. It's a fascinating report. To start addressing the question, is the EU-Turkey statement still fit for purpose? I would say that to an extent it was never fit for purpose because, as you very rightly pointed out, Martina, it was done in the framework of an emergency, and there was an effort at the time to sort of bring Turkey to the negotiating table and offer as much as possible without necessarily being able to deliver on either side. And this was acknowledged also, I think, to an extent by the Vice President before. There are elements that are very important and need to be maintained. I'm specifically referring here to the financial assistance, the FRIT, the Facility for Syrians in Turkey. Whether it's going to be still called FRIT or something else, it's really irrelevant. But the financial assistance for the Syrians is key because Turkey is currently hosting almost 4 million Syrian refugees. The cost is, I think, almost impossible to calculate right now. We don't even have exact data, but we know that it is very large. And despite positive steps that have been made, there are still significant gaps in terms of access to education for Syrian children, access to employment for Syrian refugees, and there needs to be also financial support for the local communities, precisely to assist and counterbalance, to an extent, this feeling that Turkey has been also left a little bit on its own to manage the Syrian refugees. But where I would urge a rethink of the statement is first on the question of returns. This was a very big focus in the EUTurkey Statement in the first version, so to speak, of the deal. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for different reasons. Part of it has to do with how asylum actually functions and this bizarre expectation that was in place that everything would be done very smoothly, very quickly, very efficiently, and people would just miraculously be sent back to Turkey. Also, this, in my view, a little bit weird expectation that Turkey would miraculously accept everyone back. And it also raises a question which we saw for the past, I would say, 3 years. Why do we need a separate framework for returns between the EU and Turkey, considering we have a EU-Turkey readmission agreement, which Turkey has sort of suspended unilaterally at the moment? And the third point I would like to make, and I would leave it at that, is that we need to seriously rethink in the new negotiation what's going to happen with the non-Syrians in Turkey. And I'm specifically referring here to the Afghans. They have a very different framework than the Syrians. They don't have the same level of protection that the Syrians enjoy. There have been a lot of reports about deportations of Afghans to Afghanistan. In 2019, the data that I have from Turkey is around 40,000. That's a significant number to a country that is not overly safe, one could say. So I think we need to reconsider how to support Turkey in supporting the non-Syrian refugees in a new version of the statement.
Thanks so much for these thoughts, Angeliki. And I'm really glad you bring up the question of non-Syrians. Again, the statement was put together in a very specific context 5 years ago, looking at the population on Greek islands, in the camps. It's quite clear that that has changed significantly, rightly pointing out Afghans. We're also seeing other nationalities, including Somalis. Those are nationalities that tend to traditionally enjoy very strong asylum recognition rates, but are not covered by the current statement. And so it would be really interesting to see if they are included in some future type of support as part of the agreement. Asli, I'll turn to you now for your thoughts and any additional remarks on what the Vice President said on the report, the research, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. I think that we have to face the fact that this refugee deal is fundamentally working and has been successful, even though its tenets, aspects of the deal are not working. We are in this strange situation in which none of the promises to Turkey or sort of some of the more fundamental aspects of the deal that made it more humane and palatable to all of us in its original conceptions are not there. They're not working. People have talked about how resettlement, there are problems there, certainly problems on the readmission front. There has been criticism about pushbacks. Europe has been criticized by human rights organizations for shrugging off the humanitarian protection responsibilities, etc. But at the end of the day, it has managed its core goals, which is externalizing Europe's migration management issue and essentially striking a transactional arrangement with Turkey, which I think defines the future of Turkish-European relationship. Some of the aspects that are raised and some of the criticism, I think, it is in the category of you can't have the cake and eat it too. So you can't have a deal with a country that has the sort of like the domestic scene that Turkey is, a deal that is about having the refugees stay in Turkey for a financial arrangement that has so worked, but also want to have a very sort of, a component of it that would please the human rights community, that would please the sort of the broader political community, that would comfort the European taxpayers, etc. It has a ton of elements that are very uncomfortable, but the broad outlines are working. But the one other aspect that I have to underline is this has significantly increased Turkey's political leverage over Europe. And that's another uncomfortable fact. But there is no doubt that, it has created a strategic dependency of sorts. I liken it to the Turkish role during the Cold War in some fashion. There's no doubt that it has also made Europe a little bit less willing to pressure Turkey on human rights. This is an issue that people raise in Turkey. It's the primary source of criticism inside Turkey, if you want to know, in terms of what Turkish liberals and pro-European community feel about this deal. And I think it has created a new consensus about Turkey inside Europe, which is it's an uncomfortable, difficult neighbor, but we need a stable relationship with Turkey. And that involves things like keeping the accession framework for Turkey, even though it is very clear that Turkey has moved away from Copenhagen criteria. There seems to be a consensus among member states that, yes, Turkey has an inward-looking domestic trajectory, that it has moved away from European norms, that it has moved away from Copenhagen criteria, that the domestic scene is not good, but we keep the accession process, keep Turkey as a member state even. There are other quid pros or uncomfortable sort of compromises that are made that are part of this deal. And it is what it is, and I think it does provide a blueprint for other countries. Because of the strategic dependency. Again, it's one of these you can't have the cake and eat it situation. A few things, it's very clear that a new package is going to be negotiated. It's important for Turkey at a time that it's suffering economically, but I think it is also important for Ankara, for Erdogan, to maintain his leverage over Europe. It's very clear that both sides want it. I think this 1% idea is super interesting. I hope Martin and others continue to talk about it. But when it comes to the financial package and how it is negotiated and where the money goes, I'm more skeptical that the preference of European citizens, which is the findings of your study, will be heard. In other words, Turkey has always wanted give us a check. The government has always said, give us a check. And European Union has said, but that's not how we work. We can give it, to projects and various other external, also non-government entities. And I think that a compromise will, in the end, be more, not so much giving the government a blank check, but perhaps supporting state institutions more. And from what Martin has been telling us, that's clearly not the voice of the European citizens. They want more accountability. They want more stakeholders, increasing the stakeholders, having more non-governmental funding streams. But it doesn't seem to me that will be the direction this will go when we start negotiating a new package. And finally, I think the Turkish-Greek component, Turkish-Greek relations, its current state is the Achilles heel of this whole arrangement, despite the fact that Turkey is having better and better relations with some member states, including Germany, Italy, Spain, and who continue to want, who are pushing for a positive agenda in the debate inside Europe. I don't really see Turkish-Greek relations improving, and I think this is worrisome to me. This is worrisome to me from a domestic angle. It's worrisome to me as a possible hurdle in this whole affair down the road. Yes, there's direct talks, as you know, they've started, but the East Med de-escalation that we're seeing right now, and the fact that Turkish-Greek relations are looking stable right now, seem more of a pause to me than a real sort of strategic, deep, structured strategic debate between the two countries that needs to happen at some point. So those are some of the caveats. and hard realities that I see in the next term.
Asli, thank you very much for this kind of quite pragmatic interjection. It's really fascinating to hear someone also frame things kind of less idealistically and a bit more like, this is what's happening, it's happened already, and this is the framework. So really appreciate that input. I want to invite the audience to send us some more questions for our experts. I would love to come back to the issue of Turkish relations as the Achilles heel, but I also want to give Martin a chance to reflect on these comments before Agiliki and Asli get a round of questions as well. So please send me a few more questions. We don't have a lot of time left. But we'd love to hear from you and address some of your questions more directly. Martin, any comments or thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this really insightful reflections. Maybe just one point. There's a lot of debate whether and to what extent the EU-Turkey cooperation can be a model or not, and you discussed this with the Vice President as well. And I think one interesting difference or tension is that, as Asli said, that there are the broader EU-Turkey relations, and then there's the migration cooperation. And we spoke to policymakers, and of course, one strategic question is to what extent do you keep linking the migration cooperation to the wider issues, or do you try to de-link? And a lot of the policymakers told us, actually, compared to many other areas of EU-Turkey relations, the migration cooperation has worked quite well. So, this is an area that it's been resilient despite the politics, despite the controversial debates in all countries. It's been resilient. So, there was no kind of common view on that, but one could argue that one way to go is to try to de-link it, if possible, from the wider issues, and to say this is a cooperation that needs to be improved, but that we focus on migration. But of course, when we think about EU-Africa, for example, if you look at the new pact, there, the linking of migration to other issues is an explicit goal. And again, Vice President mentioned this, that they want to link migration to trade, to development, to all those other issues. So I think there is an interesting difference in that strategic approach.
Thanks, Martin. I have a couple of questions here. A few of them are a bit long. So I'm going to take some liberties, and I apologize. I hope I don't butcher them in the process. But I have a question from Eric Rankin from the Kurdish Institute in Brussels. And he poses a sort of ethically based question. He says, how can one continue to justify this deal with Turkey? He goes on to say that Turkey has been an aggressor locally and regionally. And how can you justify, spending EU money potentially with fewer strings attached, especially if there is some kind of fungibility in a new package for Turkey, when Turkey will use this to continue being a regional aggressor? Without endorsing Mr. Rankin's views, I'd love to hear your reflections on these issues, especially with regards to Turkey's role in Syria and regionally on the eastern side rather than the western side as well.
The criticism that this the migration deal has reduced EU's transformative agenda towards Turkey, which has been the core element of its relations with Turkey over the past several decades, has reduced that to nothing but virtue signaling on human rights, is often made in Turkey. It's a standard criticism of the deal among Turkey's intelligentsia and liberals and human rights community, and even opposition politicians. So, but to get to the issue of Syria specifically, I think that one of the shortcomings and I'm not going to be directly addressing the question here, but I'll be talking about Syria. One of the shortcomings of the deal, to be on, there are several other, but one of the core elements has been that it has been quite oblivious, it has been quite blind to a European role in Syria and in stabilization and transformation of Syria. In other words, it was a deal specifically about refugees, but with the Assad regime still in place, Syria divided into three parts: Kurdish-controlled areas, Turkey-controlled areas, and regime-controlled areas. There is almost no European role or leverage. There is some European humanitarian role, but I do think that it's time to start talking about what Europe, a sort of a heavier European footprint, both in the political level in terms of the stabilization and transformation of that country, and in terms of aid. There has long been a European position on, we're not going to provide stabilization aid as long as Assad is there, and this is understandable. This was understandable when there was a chance of change. And no doubt Assad is, this is a brutal regime that has killed and repressed its own people. But we are in a new reality in which the regime seems to be staying in power. And it seems to me that Europeans need to get more involved, not just on the humanitarian side, but in terms of stabilization efforts into all three components of this country. All three different government structures in this country. We just cannot focus on the people in Turkey only, not because there is huge expectations of returns to Syria, but there's still millions of people, 4 million in Turkey-controlled areas in Idlib, and roughly 2 million in Syrian Kurdish-controlled areas that are outside regime control and dependent on the sort of the meager UN aid that is coming through. So this should be a huge focus of European political engagement over the next term.
Thanks, Asli. I'd like to quickly invite Angeliki to give us her thoughts before we close this session, but all is not lost. We can continue having a conversation and conclude it in a sort of more comprehensive way. If you want to continue staying with us for the next 15 minutes, please also follow the link that Cornelia has posted into the chat room, and we can carry on there. But Angeliki, just a few thoughts before we switch rooms into the link that we have in our chat.
So I would say that there is indeed an ethical dimension, as there is an ethical dimension in almost all deals that have to do with migration. Geography cannot be overcome or bypassed, and that's important to acknowledge. And if I may, for me, one of the lessons of the statement is precisely that, because it has resulted in a dependency with Turkey, and not just with Turkey, we have similar deals like this developing around the world. Because it creates dependency, and over-dependency is never a good thing in international relations, it is important, and there I will agree with Asli, that the EU becomes more actively involved in the neighborhood, intervenes in crisis, potentially before they become full-fledged crisis, doesn't just focus only on humanitarian aid, although that's very important, and proposes partnerships that actually benefit the migrants and the refugees that are being hosted in the third countries.
Angeliki, thank you so much for being so brief as well. Let's try and continue for a few minutes for those who are keen to stay with us. If you go into your chat, you will see that Cornelia Gold has shared a link. That's like the overflow gossip room in the real world, but online. So please join me and some of our guests there so we can conclude. Thank you so much for staying with us. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Asli, and thank you, Angeliki, and all the technical team at Medam for the fantastic content and discussion. And I hope to see some of you in the overflow room. Thank you.